In the winter of 1933, Germany felt colder than the season itself. The wind that blew through the streets of Berlin carried more than snow. It carried the memory of hunger, the echo of riots, and the dull ache of a nation humiliated. Factories sat idle, windows broken or boarded shut. Men gathered at soup kitchens wearing coats inherited from better years. Veterans limped past shuttered shops, their medals irrelevant in a country that had lost not only a war, but its direction. 10 years earlier, hyperinflation had devoured the savings of millions. Banknotes were swept from floors like autumn leaves. By the time the Great Depression arrived, Germany had nothing left to absorb its blow. 6 million were out of work. The Weimar government staggered under debt it could never repay, and the Treaty of Versailles hung over everything like a steel weight, a reminder that Germany's army was not allowed to exceed 100,000 men, its navy reduced to insignificance, its air force forbidden altogether. It was in this landscape of despair that Adolf Hitler took power. His promises were simple, but electrifying: jobs, strength, and the return of national pride. To millions of Germans exhausted by failure, those promises glowed like embers in a dark room. But promises are not budgets, and Hitler inherited a treasury that was effectively empty. Behind the spectacle of rallies and torchlit parades lay a truth that worried many inside the new regime. Germany was bankrupt. Its gold reserves were negligible. Its credit abroad was poisoned, and its industries, though still skilled, lacked the fuel, steel, and capital needed for mass military production. Yet, within just 6 years, Hitler would unveil a war machine capable of overrunning most of Europe. Panzer divisions would sweep across Poland and France. The Luftwaffe would darken the skies from Rotterdam to Kiev. German factories would churn out artillery, ammunition, and vehicles in quantities that stunned foreign observers. How had a nation so bankrupt, so constrained, rebuilt itself into a titan? The answer begins with a man standing almost unnoticed at the edge of Hitler's first cabinet meeting. Hjalmar Schacht, a banker with a sharp mind and a reputation for solving impossible economic puzzles. To Hitler, Schacht offered something more valuable than loyalty. He offered the illusion of solvency. One contemporary described Schacht's manner as quiet, patient, and dangerous. The kind of man who could turn a signature into a weapon. And he understood the urgency of the moment. If the regime failed to produce results quickly, the fragile support it enjoyed might evaporate. Hitler needed jobs. He needed growth. And most of all, he needed rearmament, the core of his vision for Germany's return. But to rearm openly was to break Versailles. To rearm legally was to spend money Germany didn't have. So, Schacht proposed a third path, neither legal nor openly illegal, a path hidden in the shadows of financial innovation. The first years of Hitler's rule unfolded with unnerving speed. Unemployment fell as public works projects, highways, bridges, military barracks disguised as labor service centers, spread across the country. The clatter of construction masked a deeper shift. Industries producing civilian goods were slowly nudged, then pulled, then ordered into the orbit of military production. But the heart of this transformation was invisible. Factories received payments for weapons, aircraft, and munitions from something called MEFO bills, official-looking documents issued by a fake company with no employees, no products, and no office. These bills served as IOUs, backed by the promise that Germany would redeem them someday. But someday was a dangerous word. It assumed that Germany would survive long enough and conquer enough to pay its debts. In a small drafting room at the Ministry of Economics, a young clerk, one of those composite figures who stands in for dozens of real witnesses, watched stacks of MEFO bills pile up. He later wrote in a notebook, "We are constructing a house of mirrors. No one knows what is real." Outside, however, the scheme was working. Factories roared to life. Smokestacks brightened night skies. Young men lined up at recruitment offices, some drawn by patriotism, others simply grateful for work. To the average German family, it looked as though the country had risen from its knees. What they could not see was the tightrope beneath their feet. Schacht's system depended on secrecy, coercion, and speed. The economy could not slow. The government could not admit weakness, and Hitler could not afford to hesitate. Every mark spent on rearmament was borrowed against the idea of future conquest. It was, in a sense, the most dangerous bet of the 20th century. Germany would rebuild its military before its economy collapsed under the weight of the lie. By 1936, the tension between ambition and ability, the core conflict of this story, was already visible to those who looked closely. But to a nation desperate for hope, the new uniforms, the new tanks, the new parades felt undeniable, almost triumphant. The narrator might say in a calm, reflective tone, Germany believed it had found a miracle. What it had found was a countdown. In the spring of 1934, Germany's cities hummed with a new and unfamiliar sound, factories working through the night. Sparks showered from welding torches. Steel presses slammed rhythmically like mechanical heartbeats. Trains rattled through the countryside carrying coal, iron ore, and newly forged parts. To a nation that had spent years in silence, the noise felt like resurrection. But the true engine powering this revival did not run on coal or manpower. It ran on secrecy. Inside the Ministry of Economics in Berlin, Hjalmar Schacht and a close circle of advisors crafted what might be the most audacious financial illusion of the modern era. The problem was simple. Germany needed billions of marks to rearm, and it had none. The solution was something no conventional economist would have dared attempt. Schacht created a shadow currency. It was called the MEFO bill, an unremarkable sheet of paper bearing the name of a company that did not exist, Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, or MEFO for short. This phantom corporation issued promissory notes to German factories for the weapons they produced. The bills looked official, even elegant, stamped with the Reich's seal and signed by men whose authority was unquestioned. There was only one problem. MEFO produced nothing and owned nothing. But that was the brilliance of the scheme. Factories accepted MEFO bills because the government forced banks to treat them as valid credit. Banks obeyed because refusing meant confrontation with the Nazi state, and the state had made its intentions clear. Soon, nearly every major industrial firm, Krupp, Rheinmetall, Messerschmitt, held vaults filled with MEFO bills, trusting that the Reich would someday redeem them for real money. It was financial alchemy on a national scale. One engineer at a Stuttgart armaments plant recalled seeing crates of MEFO bills stacked taller than a man, wrapped in twine, as if they were actual exports. In his diary, he wrote, "We work with metal, but we are paid in hopes." Still, the illusion worked beautifully. Production soared. Unemployment fell rapidly. Within 2 years, Germany had begun building warships, tanks, and aircraft in direct violation of Versailles. Yet, few abroad understood how a supposedly bankrupt nation could afford such expansion. Diplomats in Paris and London exchanged memoranda filled with concern, but not comprehension. They believed Germany was manipulating budgets, hiding tax revenue, or shifting funds from social programs. None imagined that an economy could be rebuilt on promissory notes backed not by gold, but by fear. Meanwhile, at home, Germans witnessed a transformation that felt almost supernatural. Highways stretched across the land in sleek new arcs. Airfields rose from meadows. Barracks multiplied across hillsides. Uniformed tailors worked overtime. In working-class neighborhoods, fathers returned home with pay envelopes again, and mothers could buy bread without counting every coin. But prosperity came with a tightening grip. By 1935, price controls, wage freezes, and ration laws crept into place. Propaganda stressed unity and sacrifice. Guns before butter, one slogan declared, a phrase that offered both pride and threat. At the Ministry of Labor, a fictionalized but representative official described the change. It was not an economy anymore, it was a mobilization. Farmers were ordered to increase output without raising prices. Industrialists were told which contracts they must accept, which materials they could use, which quotas they must meet. Failure meant being labeled uncooperative, a word that in the Third Reich carried consequences far beyond taxation. Yet outwardly, everything appeared controlled, almost orderly. This was one of the great contrasts of the era. A state improvising frantically behind closed doors presented itself as a model of discipline and resurgence. To the average German worker, the rearmament boom felt like a promise kept. To the economists overseeing it, it felt like standing on a bridge built from matchsticks. The essence of the scheme, the core tension at the heart of this documentary, was that Germany was building a first-class military with second-class resources, and no long-term means to pay for any of it. The larger the Wehrmacht grew, the more MEFO bills accumulated. Factories thrived on paper money that could only be redeemed if Germany achieved something unthinkable. It would have to win a war, quickly, decisively, before the bills came due. By late 1936, shocked privately warned Hitler, the economy can support rapid rearmament or long-term stability. It cannot sustain both. Hitler listened, then chose rearmament. As the sun set behind the smokestacks of the Ruhr, one could feel the shift in the air, a sense of acceleration, of gathering momentum. Germany was rising, yes, but it was rising on a wave that could not carry it forever. The narrator's voice would close this chapter with quiet gravity. Germany was not preparing for war because it was strong. It was preparing for war because it could no longer afford peace. By 1937, the foundations of Hitler's economic miracle had begun to tremble. MEFO bills, these elegant slips of imaginary credit, were piling up faster than anyone had intended. Armament plants had expanded, wages were being paid, steel was being ordered, and factories were producing weapons at a feverish pace. But the government behind it all was struggling under a truth that could only be whispered. Germany was out of time. Inside ministries in Berlin, financial officers quietly tracked a growing problem. MEFO bills worth billions of marks were approaching their redemption dates. If Germany paid them in real currency, the treasury would collapse. If it refused, the banks would collapse. And if either collapsed, the illusion of prosperity that held the nation together would shatter. It was here, under the pressure of an approaching financial abyss, that the character of Hitler's economic strategy changed. What had begun as clever manipulation now hardened into something darker, more ruthless. A system fueled not by innovation, but by fear and coercion. Factories that once embraced rearmament for profit found themselves too deep to refuse military contracts. Wages were fixed, prices were frozen, unions had been abolished. Workers were assigned rather than hired. In the cities, rationing began quietly, first in whispers, then in the kitchens of working families. A composite figure, a machinist from Essen, described the moment he realized the country had entered a new phase. Watching inspectors patrol a factory floor, he whispered to a colleague, "It's not an economy anymore, it's a command." Across Germany, the regime searched for new ways to finance its ambitions. The next source of wealth was not hidden in ledgers. It was hidden in plain sight, inside the homes, businesses, and bank accounts of millions of Jews. What followed was not merely discrimination. It was economic assault. Jewish-owned shops were forced to sell at fractions of their value. Bank accounts were frozen. Atonement fines were imposed after Kristallnacht. Gold, jewelry, insurance payouts, all were seized. Entire lives' worth of savings vanished into Reich coffers. This was no accident of policy. It was a pillar of rearmament. The narrator's voice might pause here, letting the weight settle. Germany's recovery had begun with paper. Its expansion now turned to plunder. But the most dramatic shift came not from internal theft, but from Hitler's widening gaze toward Europe. If Germany could not pay for its weapons through production, credit, or coercion, there remained one final source of revenue, with precedent as old as war itself: conquest. As early as 1938, Hitler tested the strategy. The annexation of Austria brought not only applause from cheering crowds, but access to the Austrian gold reserves and banking system. The occupation of Czechoslovakia brought the Skoda Armament Works, one of the largest weapons manufacturers in Europe, under German control. Each takeover strengthened the Reich's economic position. Each victory delayed the financial reckoning, and each step deepened Hitler's belief that aggression, not caution, was the only path forward. Within the Reich Chancellery, Hermann Göring, charged with overseeing economic mobilization, argued openly for expansion. We must take by force what the world denies us by trade. By the time German forces crossed into Poland in September 1939, the blueprint of the Nazi war economy was unmistakable. It was a machine that could only run on external fuel. Without conquest, the internal system would collapse. Without expansion, the debts would suffocate the Reich. What followed Poland was even more telling. In France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Norway, German occupation authorities confiscated raw materials, industrial output, foreign currency reserves, and food supplies. Central banks were stripped. Art, gold, and securities disappeared into trains bound for Berlin. A war correspondent described the moment he saw German officers cataloging crates from a French vault. It was not simply looting, it was accounting. But the most chilling aspect was this: the system worked, at least for a while. The loot from Europe's economies financed the Wehrmacht's expansion across the continent. Forced labor replaced shortages in manpower. Factories once owned by free citizens now served the Reich's strategic needs. Yet beneath the surface, the same flaw that had haunted Germany since 1933 continued to widen. The Reich could seize wealth, but it could not sustain it. It could harvest an empire, but it could not cultivate one. Every victory was a deposit. Every month of occupation, a withdrawal. The math was turning against them. The narrator would step forward here, with a note of inevitability. Germany's war machine was not built to last. It was built to advance. Conquest was no longer a choice. It was the only way to keep the system alive. And that meant, the moment Germany stopped winning, even for a season, everything that held the Reich together, its army, its economy, its illusion of invincibility, would begin to collapse under the weight of its own momentum. By the summer of 1941, German soldiers stood on the edge of the Soviet Union, staring into a frontier that stretched farther than any horizon they had ever known. Behind them lay the conquered wealth of Europe: gold from Vienna, coal from Belgium, machinery from Prague, grain from Ukraine, francs and guilders taken from vaults in Paris and Amsterdam. It was a plunder unprecedented in scale, a river of stolen resources that fed the Wehrmacht's appetite for steel, fuel, and ammunition. And yet, even at its height, the German war economy was already beginning to break. Inside the Reich Ministry of Economics, officials studied figures that told a story far different from the triumphant headlines. MEFO bills, the hidden backbone of rearmament, were coming due. Occupied territories were producing less than expected. Forced labor filled factories, but could not replace skilled workers lost to the front. The Wehrmacht consumed supplies faster than Europe could provide them. Then, with the invasion of the Soviet Union, Germany attempted something no modern state had ever tried: waging a continental war using an economy that had never been solvent. For a time, victory masked the danger. Town after town fell. Soviet factories were captured, raw materials seized, oil fields approached. In those early weeks, the war seemed to validate Hitler's long-believed doctrine. War is the continuation of economics by other means. But Germany had miscalculated the sheer immensity of the East. The Wehrmacht's supply lines stretched thin. Vehicles broke down faster than they could be replaced. Ammunition expenditures skyrocketed. Troops ate through reserves intended for months in mere weeks. And the Soviet Union, unlike the smaller nations Germany had overrun, did not collapse. It fought back with a scale and resilience the Germans had not imagined. Back in Berlin, Goering demanded more steel, more aircraft, more tanks. Production chiefs replied with the same refrain: "We have taken everything Europe can give." The war economy, born from illusion and sustained by conquest, had reached its limit. It could grow no further. A composite figure, a German quartermaster stationed near Smolensk, captured the moment in a letter never meant for history. "We advance, but our strength does not. The front grows longer, the supplies grow shorter, and the bills grow larger. We are spending the future to pay for today." That sentence could have served as the epitaph for the entire Nazi economic system. As 1942 unfolded, the cracks widened. Oil reserves dried. Factories suffered shortages of copper, aluminum, and rubber. Bombing raids slowed output. Armament contracts multiplied faster than resources to fill them. Financial officers quietly warned that the Reich was nearing a breaking point, not from lack of will, but from the mathematics of exhaustion. Then came Stalingrad. The loss of an entire army was more than a military disaster. It was an economic catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands of weapons, vehicles, and tons of equipment were permanently lost. Replacements required raw materials Germany no longer possessed. Rebuilding demanded labor Germany no longer controlled. And morale, once the Reich's most valuable and visible asset, fell into a darkness that could not be repaired. By 1943, Germany's economic machine was no longer a miracle. It was a drain. Occupied territories resisted, sabotaged, or produced less. Shipping lanes tightened, manpower shortages deepened. The Luftwaffe consumed aircraft faster than they could be built. And the MEFO bills, those secret promises written nearly a decade earlier, hung over the economy like a storm cloud. In a tense meeting that year, one financial advisor told Göring, "We cannot pay for the war unless we win it, and we cannot win the war unless we halt what we are spending." It was a paradox with no escape. Hitler refused cuts, he refused retreat, he refused reality. And so, the Reich continued forward, driven not by strategy, but by inertia, toward a fate it had sealed the very moment it chose expansion over solvency, conquest over sustainability. Germany was no longer fighting for victory. It was fighting to postpone collapse. As the Allies advanced from the west and the Red Army closed from the east, the economic empire Hitler had built began to crumble visibly. Factories were bombed into silence. Railroads twisted into fire. Gold reserves vanished. Looted art and currency were packed into caves. Bureaucrats burned files that chronicled the shadow economy that had sustained the regime. By April 1945, the German treasury was empty. Not metaphorically, literally. There was no gold, no credit, no functioning tax system. The Reich had become a hollow shell, propped up only by the remnants of its own propaganda and the last, exhausted divisions still fighting at the front. The narrator might speak softly here, with the weight of the century behind the words. In the end, Hitler did not bankrupt Germany. Germany had been bankrupt the moment he began. What collapsed in 1945 was not simply a nation at war. It was an economic illusion sustained by terror, deception, and relentless expansion. An illusion that required endless victories to survive and could endure not a single decisive defeat. The Third Reich was not destroyed by armies alone. It was destroyed by arithmetic. No empire, the narrator concludes, can outrun the truth of its own ledger.